I adored and adore Elizabeth. We just find it impossible to live together.
Richard Burton once said he hated Elizabeth Taylor in a way the world never understood. For decades, people assumed it was just a dramatic remark from a fiery man. But the real reason behind that feeling was far more complicated and far more hidden than anyone realized. This video unravels what pushed their famous love story into a place of resentment that he rarely spoke about, and why the truth stayed buried until long after their headlines faded. When Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor first met, people around them felt an instant pull between the two. It was powerful, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. But behind that spark was a tension that few understood at the time. Their chemistry was real, yet it carried an undercurrent of competition and pride that shaped everything that followed. On the set of Cleopatra, crew members later recalled moments when their exchanges turned sharp without warning. One minute they were laughing, and the next they were locked in a stare that made the room go silent. Burton, who was used to owning the stage with his booming voice and commanding presence, suddenly found himself in the shadow of someone who could match him in every way. Taylor's fame, her confidence, and her ability to dominate any room challenged him more than he expected. Burton admired her, but admiration slowly mingled with unease. He once told a friend that being around Taylor felt like holding fire with bare hands. He was drawn in, but he could not control the heat. Taylor, for her part, often pushed forward without hesitating. She thrived on intensity, and she never softened herself to make anyone comfortable, not even the man she was falling for. Those early days revealed the first cracks in their foundation. Supporters saw passion, but the people closest to them noticed something different. Two strong personalities locked in a dance neither of them knew how to lead. By the time the world crowned them the greatest lovers of their era, the friction beneath that title was already growing, and it would soon become impossible for Burton to ignore. But that was only the beginning. What developed next cut far deeper than either of them expected. As their connection deepened, Richard Burton began to see how different their worlds truly were. Elizabeth Taylor was already a global icon, someone studios treated like royalty. Burton was respected, but he was still climbing. The gap between their status did not bother her, but it quietly gnawed at him. Every decision, every negotiation, every headline seemed to tilt in her favor, and that imbalance planted a resentment he kept hidden for years. The turning point came during Cleopatra. Taylor secured a groundbreaking contract, earning a record-setting salary that stunned the entire industry. Burton knew she deserved it, yet he could not stop comparing their positions. He often joked about it in public, but those close to him later said the jokes covered a genuine bruise to his pride. He wanted to be viewed as her equal, but the industry treated him like a supporting player in her world. Even long after the film wrapped, Burton carried that bruised pride with him. Reports surfaced of him telling close friends that he felt like the second act in a story built around Taylor. He did not mean it cruelly. It was simply the truth of how he saw himself, especially as she grew more powerful while he battled his own insecurities. Biographers who reviewed his later notes described a man struggling to define himself in a relationship where the spotlight rarely fell on him. By the mid-1960s, their dynamic had shifted into something more complicated. The more the world adored them as a pair, the more Burton felt his identity slipping. Taylor became the unintentional symbol of everything he feared: being overshadowed, being controlled, and being remembered as the lesser half of a legendary couple. But the resentment that grew from that fear would lead him down a far darker path, one that would eventually change how he saw her forever. As their public fame exploded, Richard Burton began slipping into habits that slowly eroded everything around him. His drinking, already part of his life, grew into something heavier and harder to control. People who spent time with him said it changed the way he spoke, worked, and reacted. Elizabeth Taylor tried to help in her own way, But Burton often felt her concern turning into pressure. What she saw as protection, he experienced as control. Friends later shared that Burton sometimes blamed Taylor for waking up parts of him he wished had stayed quiet. Their relationship was so intense that it fed every emotion he had, good or bad. When they were happy, he felt invincible. When they fought, he sank. And in those darker moments, he reached for the bottle with a level of desperation that frightened people close to him. Taylor tried to step in, but Burton grew resentful whenever she pushed too hard. The more he leaned on drinking, the more their arguments escalated. Unlike their early clashes, which had a kind of spark to them, these new fights carried exhaustion. Taylor's patience wore thin as she tried to keep him steady. Yet Burton saw her efforts as another reminder of how deeply he depended on her. For a man who had built his identity on strength and talent, that dependence ate at him. By the time their first marriage began to crack, both of them knew something had shifted. Burton once commented to a confidant that Taylor brought out the fire and the smoke, a remark that revealed how conflicted he felt. She awakened his passion, but she also awakened the parts of himself he could not control. That inner turmoil was something he struggled to face, and it left a mark he carried long after the divorce papers were signed. But even with the marriage falling apart, their story was nowhere near finished. What happened next surprised everyone around them and set the stage for a regret Burton would later hint at more than once. When Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor reunited after their divorce, many people assumed they were destined to circle back to each other. Their connection had always been intense, and that intensity often blurred the line between love and habit. But this second attempt at marriage was built more on nostalgia than healing, and the issues that once tore them apart were waiting for them the moment they walked back into each other's lives. Friends who spent time with them during those early months said nothing had really changed. Burton still struggled with the same internal battles, and Taylor still tried to steer the relationship with the same determination she always had. What felt romantic from the outside was, in reality, a return to the same patterns that had exhausted them before. It did not take long for Burton to realize that he had stepped back into a storm he was no longer strong enough to weather. Years later, biographers uncovered entries from Burton's journals that hinted at deep regret soon after their remarriage. He described feeling drained rather than revived, as if the second union amplified everything he had tried to escape. Taylor, meanwhile, hoped they could somehow recapture the magic of their early years, but the pressures of fame, responsibility, and their own stubborn personalities made that impossible. Their memories held the good moments tightly, but their reality magnified the bad. The second divorce came quickly, surprising those who still believed their love could overpower their flaws. For Burton, the split left a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. He cared for Taylor, but he also knew he could not live inside a cycle that kept breaking him down. That realization pushed him toward the private bitterness he would later express in ways the world would not hear until much later. And yet, even with two failed marriages, their story still was not finished. Something bigger was brewing beneath the surface, something Burton himself would only confess in his most unguarded moments. Years after both marriages ended, a different picture of Richard Burton began to emerge through the recollections of people who knew him best. He often spoke openly about his love for Elizabeth Taylor, but in quieter moments, he revealed a much harsher truth. He confided to close friends that there were days he hated what their relationship had turned him into. It was not a word he used lightly, and it shocked those who heard it. They never forgot the way he said it, with a mix of regret, pain, and something he could not name. Biographers who later studied Burton's diaries and personal reflections found the same conflicted tone running through his private writings. He never attacked Taylor as a person. Instead, he wrote about the weight of their relationship and how it shaped the decisions he made. He believed she influenced his image so strongly that he struggled to stand on his own. To him, Taylor became a symbol of a life he felt he no longer fully controlled. There were entries where Burton admitted feeling like he had lost pieces of himself during their years together. He mentioned moments when he felt overshadowed, guided, or misunderstood. He had always been proud, and the idea of being molded by someone else cut into that pride. Modern researchers who reviewed these writings described a man wrestling with two truths. He loved Taylor deeply, and he also resented what being with her forced him to confront. The most striking part of these findings was the intensity of his language. Burton rarely showed such vulnerability in public, but in private, he wrote with a raw honesty that surprised the people who later read it. His resentment was never simple anger. It was frustration tangled with longing, admiration mixed with fear, and affection wrapped in self-criticism. He did not hate her as the world might assume. He hated the version of himself that he believed she drew out. But this emotional conflict only grew stronger as he entered the final years of his life, leading to one last attempt at understanding their bond before time ran out. As the years passed, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor drifted into a quieter kind of connection. The public no longer saw them together, but behind closed doors they exchanged occasional messages that carried more weight than they let on. Their lives had moved in different directions, yet neither of them ever fully stepped out of the other's shadow. Friends said that whenever Burton spoke her name, something in his voice shifted. There was affection, but also an ache that never quite faded. During his final years, Burton wrote a message to Taylor that he never mailed. It was found much later among his belongings, and it stunned those who read it. Instead of bitterness, the words were warm, gentle, and full of reflection. He thanked her for the years they spent together and hinted that he still cared in a way he could not easily explain. It contrasted everything he had confessed in frustration, revealing a softer side that he rarely allowed others to see. Elizabeth Taylor eventually learned about this message, and people close to her said it moved her deeply. She kept a copy of it near her bedside, a quiet reminder of a bond that never fully broke. To her, that letter showed the Richard Burton she always believed existed beneath the storms, the thoughtful, conflicted man who loved fiercely even when he could not show it. This discovery reshaped how people viewed their relationship. It proved that Burton's bitterness was not simple anger. It was a complicated tangle of love, loss, pride, and regret. And it set the stage for the final truth behind why he once said he hated her. A truth far more revealing than anyone expected. What he meant by that word would only become clear when people looked deeper into what haunted him most. When people revisit Richard Burton's most emotional reflections, one thing becomes clear. His use of the word hate had almost nothing to do with Elizabeth Taylor herself. Biographers who studied his later writings and spoke with those closest to him reached the same conclusion. Burton was not condemning Taylor. He was confronting something inside himself that their relationship forced him to face. She reflected back the parts of him he tried hardest to hide: his insecurity, his anger, his dependence, and the habits that slowly consumed him. Taylor was bold, confident, and unafraid to push him, and that intensity pulled emotions out of Burton that he did not always know how to handle. He admired her strength, but at the same time, he felt smaller beside it. That feeling turned into frustration, and frustration turned into resentment. When he said he hated her, he was speaking through the lens of a man who feared losing control of who he was becoming. Modern interviews with Burton's family members revealed a similar perspective. They said he often struggled with the idea that Taylor saw him more clearly than he wanted anyone to. She understood his vulnerabilities, and he did not like being that exposed. It made him feel powerless, and that loss of control was something he battled throughout his life. For a man who defined himself by his talent and presence, being emotionally outmatched was a wound to his pride. Their relationship amplified the best and the worst of him. In his most honest moments, Burton hinted that Taylor brought out qualities he wished he could bury: His ambition grew sharper, his temper grew shorter, his desire for escape grew stronger. It was easier to blame her than to confront what those reactions said about him. That is why the word hate surfaced when it did. It was a shield, not a conclusion. In the end, the people closest to him believed that Burton loved Elizabeth Taylor more deeply than he loved almost anyone, but he also battled himself more fiercely in her presence than at any other time in his life. Taylor was not the source of his hatred. She was the mirror that showed him the version of himself he feared most. And that reflection stayed with him long after their marriages ended. Long after Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were gone, their story refused to fade. Filmmakers, biographers, and even modern actors revisiting their work kept returning to the same question. Why did their relationship create such powerful emotions in the first place? The answer, as later revealed through interviews and rediscovered accounts, lies in the legacy they built together, one that neither of them fully understood while they were alive. As the decades passed, people close to them began sharing memories that painted an even more complex picture. Members of Burton's family described how he carried quiet regrets about the way he handled certain moments with Taylor. They said he often wondered what might have happened if he had been stronger in his early years, before fame and pressure pushed him into patterns he could not break. These reflections were not filled with blame. Instead, they showed a man who knew that the intensity of their relationship pushed him to emotional limits he was not prepared for. Taylor's friends, on the other hand, noticed how she softened whenever Burton's name came up. Even late in life, she spoke of him with a warmth that hinted at a bond she never recreated with anyone else. She understood that he had struggled with his own demons, and she often told people that the world would never truly grasp how complicated his inner life had been. To her, Burton was not defined by the anger he sometimes expressed. He was defined by the depth of feeling behind it. New stories continued to emerge from people who witnessed their private moments. One director recalled seeing Burton watch Taylor from a distance during a break in filming. He did not approach her, did not speak, did not smile. He simply watched with a look that blended admiration and melancholy. It was the expression of someone who loved a person deeply, but did not know how to fit peacefully into their world. Decades later, the director said it was the most honest moment he ever saw between them. As modern researchers dug deeper into archived interviews and unpublished notes, another theme began to appear. Burton believed that Taylor represented a life he did not feel worthy of, and that insecurity shaped everything he did. His childhood had been marked by hardship and struggle, while hers was built in front of cameras, surrounded by praise and privilege. The gap between those worlds was something he never stopped feeling. When he said he hated her, he was often speaking from the perspective of a man who felt constantly measured against someone he admired, but feared disappointing. This insight helped explain why their love endured even after their marriages ended. They were drawn to each other not because they were perfect together, but because they understood each other in ways no one else did. Their conversations, their jokes, their arguments, and even their silences carried layers of meaning that outsiders could not see. They were two people who lived extraordinary lives, but struggled with very human emotions: fear, longing, jealousy, pride, and vulnerability. In recent years, fans have re-examined their films with a new lens. Scenes that once looked like acting now seem to reveal pieces of their real emotional landscape. Burton's lingering glances, Taylor's fiery responses, and the tension between them on screen all appear different when viewed with the knowledge of what they privately endured. Their performances were not just crafted moments. They were reflections of the bond that shaped their lives both on and off the set. Today, their story is remembered not as a perfect romance, but as a powerful one. A relationship that exposed the deepest parts of who they were. Burton's struggle with his own reflection, Taylor's determination to hold their connection together, and the emotional storms they weathered still fascinate people because they feel real. Their love was messy, consuming, passionate, and painful. It was the kind of bond that changes a person forever. And perhaps that is the final truth behind Burton's most dramatic words. He did not hate Elizabeth Taylor. He hated the battles she forced him to confront inside himself. Yet he also loved her enough that those battles stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the end, their legacy is not defined by anger or regret, but by the undeniable fact that neither of them ever escaped the impact they had on each other.